For many years, beginning in college, I relapsed, and it felt like every time I slipped, I was failing. And all of those slips really did lead to this relapse that left me feeling so incredibly stuck. And so it wasn't until I began reframing my thinking around recovery that I began to actually make meaningful progress. The reframing had to do with this idea of what I call the middle place, which is, as you described, this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery.
Today, I'm excited to introduce to you my special guest, Mallary Tenore. She is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas at Austin School of Journalism and Media and Macomb School of Business, where she teaches writing and reporting courses for undergraduate and graduate students. Mallary specializes in a variety of topics, including long-form feature writing, creative nonfiction, solutions journalism, and nonprofit journalism. A longtime journalist, Mallary's articles and essays have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Teen Vogue, the Dallas Morning News, the Tampa Bay Times, Harvard University's Neiman Storyboard, and more. She also maintains a weekly newsletter called Right at the Edge, where she shares writing tips and best practices. Mallary's debut nonfiction novel called Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, will be published by Simon & Schuster's Simon Element imprint and is now available for pre-order. The book blends immersive reporting, emerging science, and social history around eating disorders alongside Mallary's own harrowing journey from a childhood with anorexia to her present-day reality as a mother in recovery. Without further ado, here's Mallary. Mallary, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I got to read your book, Slip, and it is amazing. One thing that I want to ask you about is that I had actually never heard of a restorative narrative versus a redemptive narrative, but that makes a lot of sense. So maybe you could fill us in about narratives and why they're actually important. But you really took care to note that Slip is a restorative narrative rather than a redemptive narrative. And so wondering if you could fill us in on what does that mean and why is that distinction important?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think for me, I read a lot of books on eating disorders when I was acutely sick and when I was in the early stages of my recovery. And many of them were helpful, but almost all of them were written from the perspective of people who are fully recovered. I think that just naturally, our society really prefers protagonists who prevail and who are triumphant. And so those are the stories that often get held up. But I remember reading so many of those stories and feeling like there was this lack of a mirrored image. And I couldn't see my own story or myself really reflected in those books because I wasn't fully recovered and I still haven't arrived at a place of full recovery. I'm someone who still grapples with the imprints of my disorder and it still remains a vulnerability, even though I've been in recovery for 25 years. And so for me, it was really important to think more in terms of a restorative narrative. And restorative narratives don't tie up stories with a really happy ending. More so, they really explore kind of the messy middles of someone's progression from a tragedy or trauma or illness to a place of recovery. And so for me, it's been really important to kind of ask this question of what does it mean to be better, but not all better? And that question is really at the heart of restorative narratives, which really dive deep into the messiness of the recovery process and don't sugarcoat hard truths or force these endings with pretty bows. And in some ways, it feels like an act of bravery to write these restorative narratives because they're not always super popular. But in writing these restorative narratives, I find that they open up so many more points of relatability for folks. And so my hope is that Slip will really help people who are kind of in this messy middle of recovery to feel seen and heard.
Thanks for explaining that. So you're talking about really highlighting the messy middle, like the space in between, like full blown, in your experience, anorexia and other manifestations of eating disorders. And then this like place of full recovery or like being fully recovered, which I definitely want to unpack with you later because I'm like, what even is that? And you're talking about highlighting the messy middle, the middle place. Can you define that a little bit more, like describe that a little bit more?
Sure. So for so long, I really tried to reach full recovery. I was in treatment for many years as a teenager. And once I left inpatient hospitalization and then later residential treatment, I thought, okay, I've been in so many years of treatment. I've got to reach this gold standard of full recovery. And yet I didn't really know what full recovery actually meant or what it looked like because no one had explained it to me. And so for so long, I was trying to reach kind of this perfect full recovery. And after leaving residential treatment, went back to high school and was really trying to kind of do all the things and be an overachiever, eat really well, exercise, but I could only maintain that for so long. And I was petrified that if I made one wrong move, if I slipped just once, I would slide back into dangerous territory. And I didn't think there was a space in between. And so for many years, beginning in college, I relapsed. And it felt like every time I slipped, I was failing. And all of those slips really did lead to this relapse that left me feeling so incredibly stuck. And so it wasn't until I began reframing my thinking around recovery that I began to actually make meaningful progress. And the reframing had to do with this idea of what I call the middle place, which is, as you described, this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. And for me, it was helpful to think about this idea that I didn't have to necessarily aim for full recovery, but I could rather aim for more recovery in the middle place. So, this idea of trying to always aim for progress, knowing that slips and setbacks are going to happen. And so, for me, being able to give myself grace whenever I slipped rather than reprimanding myself when I slipped was really helpful because then I could use that slip as opportunities for growth. I could say, okay, I just slipped, but that's okay. What can I do about it? How can I get back up again? And that reframing for me was just incredibly helpful. And so the middle place framework is rooted in this idea that recovery is possible, but it is imperfect. It is often messy. And for many of us with eating disorders, it can be ongoing.
Yeah, I would love to unpack that more because to me, like, I feel curiosity about this because kind of how you describe the middle place is how I think about recovery. It's like in doing your research, I'm sure you came across like, oh, addiction, for example, is defined as in some places a relapsing disorder. And like, this is so normal because if we have things embedded in our brain, embedded in our body, that can never just be completely erased. And the thought that we are going to beat perfection, as you dived into in your book, perfectionism is highly correlated with eating disorder symptoms. So if we can release some perfectionism, that in a sense is recovery right there. And so when I think about the messy middle of being a place where you have slips and you have compassion about it and you're able to turn towards them, with curiosity and with a growth mindset of like, how can I learn from this instead of being absolutely devastated by this, which is what people tend to do when they're in the complete throes of their eating disorder. So yeah, to me, I'm like the messy middle, that is full recovery to me. I mean, in my experience, because I'm not perfect and I've come to a place of accept. I mean, who is perfect? Like freaking influencers on the internet who are trying to sell their programs and acting as if but no one is perfect. Even people without eating disorders like tend to overeat on occasions and they might binge on occasions. And I've done like a super deep dive into recovery myself because my PhD work was focused on binge eating disorder, and I would like being a person in recovery myself and who had struggled for so freaking long to get to the place that I am right now in recovery. I was obsessed with learning about like what is even recovery, like everything related to binge eating disorder and addiction and compulsive behaviors and urges to binge, urges to engage in eating disorder behavior, and always for us to recover. I was like, part of that in research was trying to understand what do people measure, how do they measure recovery anyway? And I was exploring some of the things that you were talking about is like these measures of like, oh, the absence of a binge or absence of restriction or absence of purging, BMI, like objective sort of measurable things, which make sense in certain eating disorder treatment centers, but that doesn't take into account the existential or phenomenological aspects of the person and like how they would interpret the recovery because maybe they are still according to these measures engaging in certain behavior, but they feel so much better. They feel optimism, they feel like they're connecting to their body, and there's other aspects that aren't being taken into account because it's not like a quantitative measure, like the fact that they are like getting outside, hanging out with friends, feeling inspired. More of their brain space is dedicated to feel good activities or like actual interests that are beyond obsession with food and their body and stuff like that. So yeah, the perfection, like to say that someone's fully recovered, like versus like what does that even mean? And so to me, I found like it really curious to think about a recovery that is like this destination that you know that's like a eat recovered versus just like life and like having complexities and nuance, and it can't be easily quantified. So that was a lot. I don't know if you could I don't know if you could respond to that. I was just like 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 I'm seriously passionate and intrigued by this topic so much.
Yeah, I just appreciate so much of what you just said, and so much of it was relatable for me. And I think you're totally right that, I mean, so many folks in the eating disorder field really push for full recovery for everyone. And in some ways, I have worried about, oh, what will the pushback to this idea of the middle place be? Because I don't want people to think that I'm suggesting that they settle for stagnancy or anything like that. And I also don't call this place quasi recovery or pseudo recovery. I think that those are pretty harmful terms that the field often uses to describe people who are no longer acutely sick but haven't reached full recovery. And I remember when I first heard those terms, I thought, huh, is my recovery fake? I mean, are my struggles or my efforts to move forward in recovery just not real because I haven't reached full recovery yet? And so I think that those terms, coupled with the terminology of full recovery, can feel limiting to folks. They can feel stigmatizing. Even the word slip has a lot of stigma and shame around it. I remember
Yeah.
someone I was interviewing for the book, she was a clinician, and she said, I wouldn't title your book Slip. She said that has a really negative connotation. And I
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
well, that's precisely the point. I want to
Yeah.
remove that stigma and shame, to normalize slips and to show that they are part of the process. And so rather than feeling shame about them, which can lead to the shame spiral and these slides and relapses, what if we tried to talk about them and to create spaces for normalizing slips in recovery? And I think that there are other fields. I mean, you mentioned addiction, for instance, that have more inclusive language around recovery. So it's quite common for someone in Alcoholics Anonymous, for instance, to say, I'm a recovering alcoholic. But to say that when you've had an eating disorder can feel shameful at times. And I used to use this language of fully recovered. And even when I was struggling with a relapse for 10 plus years and kind of got sick again, I still told people I was fully recovered because I was too afraid to reveal my struggles.
Mm,
Because I thought, well, I was sick years ago as a child. I was in all those treatment facilities. I'm supposed to be better. And so I was sort of keeping up appearances. And there was this real disconnect between the narrative that I shared with everyone and the narrative I thought I was supposed to tell and the one that I was actually living out. And so when I began to reframe my thinking around the middle place, I then gave myself permission to say, I'm in recovery, right? As opposed to
yeah.
saying, I'm fully recovered, because I don't think that full recovery has a finish line. I mean, that term in and of itself makes it seem like there's this definitive end. And I used to think of
Yeah.
recovery as being this series of straight arrows that would lead to a finish line. But now I think of it more as these circles that keep going, and you hope that they move in a forward direction, but there's no finish line. And the size of those circles can shrink or grow depending on life's ebbs and flows. So maybe the size of that circle grows during a period where you're doing really well and you're making choices in service of recovery, but maybe the circle shrinks a little bit, right, during a particular hardship or a life transition. But there's always potential for it to grow again. And so I think of recovery more along those lines. And for me, this idea of being in active and ongoing recovery helps
Hmm.
me to feel like I have something that I can keep working toward.
Another interesting thing that you talked about in the book is like the difficulty in measuring full recovery, if you know, if that's a thing, because that most women actually experience like some sort of mild, at least mild level of disordered eating or disordered manifestation, whether it's weight, preoccupation, shape, preoccupation, and so forth, which is makes a lot of sense. Like if someone, there's like levels of disorder that goes from, you need to go inpatient to your quote unquote everyday woman who lives in a society where she wants to, a lot of everyone wants to lose weight and look pretty and, feel disciplined and that they have control or whatever. And so to me, it was pretty striking. Like when you mentioned it to call attention to that is like this makes sort of measurement because if you want to say, oh, to be fully in full recovery, you're not obsessed obsessed with your body, you don't want to lose weight, you're not going to restrict your intake, when actually many women exhibit that. I believe you call it normative discontent. Can you talk about how these concepts go together?
Sure. So I remember I was talking with my former doctor from Boston Children's Hospital in Massachusetts, and that's where I was hospitalized as a child. And the doctor who treated me then still works at Boston Children's, and I
Wow.
interviewed her for the book. And I was a little afraid of telling her that I'm not fully recovered because I didn't know how she would react. And she said, "Where you're at right now is a really great place to be." And she said, "I also want you to remember that it's really hard to recover into our society." And she said, "Our society is steeped in fat phobia and in diet culture." And she kind of tapped me into this research around what's called normative discontent. I interviewed the researcher who came up with that terminology, and she talked about how research shows that the vast majority of men and women in our society have some level of discontent with their bodies. And so, for those of us with eating disorders, to think that we are going to recover and never have a bad body image day or never have some challenges with food is almost unrealistic in our society. And so, I think we really need to give ourselves grace when we consider that we don't have to recover and be better than everybody else in the sense that we're never going to think badly about ourselves or we're never going to slip. And I just remember when she told me that, I was so fascinated by that term and just by this idea that, yes, for so many years, I was trying to just be better. And I equated full recovery with never having disordered thoughts, with never having issues with food. And I mean, that pressure of trying to maintain that or even achieve that felt so insurmountable. And so I think we need to kind of be aware of that when we talk about recovery. And I think we need to try to get clarity on what we even mean by full recovery, because I poured over just hundreds of research papers and I interviewed dozens and dozens of researchers about full recovery and eating disorders. And many of them told me that it's really hard to compare data across studies when we don't have a consensus definition of what full recovery is. And some folks, some researchers will have various definitions of what weight restoration means. Some people say, well, it's reaching 100% of the median BMI, and we know BMI is a flawed measure to begin with. Others will say it's reaching 85% of the median BMI. Some researchers don't necessarily take into account the cognitive factors. So maybe someone is weight restored and they're no longer engaging in behaviors. And so they may be labeled as fully recovered, but are they fully recovered if they're still having really sort of distorted thoughts that are taking over a lot of their mental space? And then also, too, there's just variations in the duration of illness and recovery. So there are some studies that look at folks who are quote unquote fully recovered 6 months out of treatment. There's one study that looks at full recovery 22 years post treatment. So the length of time studied varies, and we know that relapse is very common in folks with eating disorders. So while yes, someone 6 months out may be quote unquote fully recovered, what does that look like for them 1 year later, 5 years later? And so I think particularly for treatment centers that are doing studies on how many of their patients have fully recovered, we really, for transparency's sake, need them to be doing more longitudinal studies for a more accurate representation of what that actually looks like. And I will say too, I by no means want to bash researchers. I'm a professor, and I think that a lot of the researchers in the eating disorder field are doing amazing work. So this is not intended to be a criticism of them individually, but more so a critique just of the kind of terminology of full recovery and the fact that the definitions of it vary so much so that there are as many definitions of full recovery as there are studies of it. And so
Hmm.
it's no
Hmm.
wonder that patients therefore have a lot of confusion around what full recovery even means.
Yeah. In your realistic perspective, what is full recovery? Like if we're measuring people who are fully recovered, like what would that do you think that that is actually realistic? Because is it the lack of struggle, but because of the normative discontent, I feel like everyone struggles. Like, so is it like a percentage of struggle or like, interpretation of how much the struggle, is it a normal amount of struggle or whatever? But can you is fully to be fully recovered, is that realistic? I would love to hear your honest thoughts there.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question to ask. And I will say that I do think that full recovery is possible for some, in the sense that I interviewed many people who do consider themselves to be fully recovered. So I don't want to discredit that terminology for folks who believe that it's true for them and their stories.
Yeah.
I think it's important to validate the language that we choose to use, so long as that language is authentic. Because, like
Yeah.
I said, for a long time, I said I was fully recovered, but I actually wasn't. And I think that
Yeah.
that can be the case for many. But I think for the folks who I interviewed who consider themselves to be fully recovered, they were weight restored if they had been struggling with restrictive eating disorders. But for them, the eating disorder was really thought of as more of a problem than the solution to their problems. So for them, they were no longer engaging in disordered behaviors as a way to cope, nor did they have the cognitive distortions or thoughts that accompany eating disorders so often. They also were not kind of struggling with things like obsessive exercise anymore. And so a lot of these behaviors that really accompanied the eating disorder were no longer there for them. And the thoughts have really, for the most part, disappeared. I mean, some people who are fully recovered said, well, yeah, I mean, I still sometimes look in the mirror and I'm not always jazzed about how I look, but I don't let
Mhm.
that dictate my choices around food. And I don't let that lead to ruminations throughout the day. And so a lot of the people I spoke to who are fully recovered kind of thought of it as a feeling of freedom, in the sense that they
Mhm.
weren't tethered to that eating disorder anymore, nor were they defined by it. So they were
Mhm.
able to see other parts of their identity and really grow those in such a way that the eating disorder was really something in the rear view. Now, that being said, some folks who I talked to who said they were fully recovered at the beginning of our conversations, by the end of it, they said, well, actually, I kind of like this idea of the middle place. I could see myself in this middle place,
Right.
farther
Yeah.
along in the middle place. If we think of it as a
Yeah.
spectrum, I'm on
Right.
the farther side of that. But I think in some ways that terminology gave them just a little bit of comfort. And so
Right.
so I think that in some ways this book may help people to just use more expansive language for talking about recovery, rather than bifurcating it into these two buckets of acute sickness or full recovery.
What was your experience like talking to so many people you did? How many interviews did you do?
So I surveyed 724 people from around the world, and then I
Mhm.
interviewed about 175 folks with lived experience, and then researchers and clinicians.
Okay, that's amazing. So, when you were interviewing the people with a lived experience, I liked that you interviewed such a wide swath of people. Like it wasn't just young white girls, which people tend to think, oh, this is the vulnerable, these are the people who have eating disorders, as young white women. But you interviewed people of all, of all types and really shone a light that there needs to be more research on these populations and also more support for these populations. Wondering if you could talk about, was it an enriching experience? Was it eye-opening? Was it surprising? Like, how was that?
Yeah, and it's a really important topic to address, because I originally conceived of this book thinking that it would be mostly about my own experiences. But the more I thought about the project, the more I realized that in many ways I fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder, and that I'm white, I'm female, I live in a smaller body, I'm middle to upper class. And I thought there's so many other folks struggling with eating disorders whose stories don't get elevated in books. And so I wanted my story to be the through line, but I wanted to be sure to include lots of other voices and perspectives, both so that I could deepen my own understanding of eating disorders, but also so that other people would read this book and see themselves reflected in it. And one thing that was interesting is that when I surveyed these 724 folks with lived experience, I asked this question about the middle place. And I said, does this idea of the middle place resonate with you? because honestly, before working on this book, I, in many ways, thought that I was the only person in this space, which seems crazy to me now looking back on it, but it felt so isolating because I never heard anyone talk about this space.
Yeah.
And when I asked this question in the survey, 85% of respondents said, yes, I can identify with this idea of the middle place. And many people I spoke to said that this space for so long seemed ineffable. They didn't have the words to describe it. And even this idea of giving this space a name felt empowering for them. So that was really gratifying just to hear that from folks. It was also just really sobering to hear some stories from individuals, for instance, who are struggling with atypical anorexia, which is when you meet all the diagnostic criteria of anorexia nervosa, except you're not clinically underweight. And
Mm.
atypical anorexia is actually a bit of a misnomer because more people than not actually are not clinically underweight when they're
Mm,
struggling with
mhm, mhm.
anorexia. There is one study of several hundred adolescents struggling with different eating disorders, and only 6% of them were clinically underweight. So puts it in perspective that
Yeah.
sometimes we have this idea that folks with eating disorders are emaciated and super underweight, when in fact, that's simply not the case. And I remember interviewing one man who struggled with atypical anorexia, lived most of his life in a larger body. And even though he was restricting his food intake, and was physically weak, he went to the doctor, and the doctor did not believe that he was struggling with an eating disorder. And I heard that story time and time again, particularly from folks who were minorities, or they were transgendered, or they were men, right? And they just didn't fit kind of that stereotype of what someone with an eating disorder looks like. And as a result, in some cases, it took a really long time for them to actually get the treatment they needed. And that speaks to this larger systemic issue around just the complete lack of medical training on eating disorders. I mean, research shows that the average medical doctor gets 0 to 2 hours of training on eating disorders. And so that's really sad when you think about the fact that 30 million Americans will struggle with an eating disorder at some point in their lives. And so, in interviewing all these different individuals, it became quite clear what the repercussions of that lack of training have been on some of these individuals who are overlooked by the medical establishment because they don't look the part, so to speak.
And I think that that actually is what contributes to this long-lasting ripple that you're talking about. If you're living, if your doctor is not taking note of your symptoms, or they're not actually taking you seriously when you bring something up, and they're living with this eating disorder for 20 years, 30 years, or however long it is, it's less likely that you're going to be able to live in a completely different way. There's going to be those ripples in your brain and your body forever that you have to live with.
Yes, exactly. Because there is research showing that the earlier someone gets treatment, the better the prognosis. So the more people wait to actually get help, or the longer they have to wait to receive that help, the higher the chance that they're going to struggle for a longer period of time.
If someone feels like that they're learning about this messy middle right now, so they're finding out about your book and they're like, oh, this really resonates with me. What is the first step that you would advise for someone who feels like they are having problems with disordered eating or eating disorder? What is the first step they can take to embrace this middle place?
So I think part of it is really trying to find someone who you trust, who you can talk to about slips or about some of these behaviors or thoughts that you're having, because eating disorders really do thrive in secrecy. And it's very easy for those of us struggling to keep our struggles secret. But secrets keep us stuck, they keep us sick, they make us sicker. And so, even if it feels like there are too many barriers at the moment to perhaps finding an eating disorder clinician, even finding someone you trust, whether it be a spouse or a sibling or a friend who you can just confide in and talk to, I think is really important. And that sounds so basic, but I say it because for a long time when I was struggling as a 12-year-old, one, I didn't exactly know what it was I was struggling with, because I thought, well, I don't have an eating disorder because people with eating disorders or with anorexia don't eat anything at all. And that's clearly not the case. But I just didn't even think that I had an eating disorder. And a lot of us with eating disorders have this idea that we're not sick enough. And that sometimes prevents us from seeking help. And so, even if you don't have a full fledged eating disorder, but you're just struggling with some of these disordered behaviors or thoughts, being able to talk about them with someone, I think, can help you to put them out in the open and can help you perhaps to either arrive at a better place or not slide into an eating disorder. Because although I talk about the middle place with regard to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery, I think it also can be an apt term for the space that people find themselves in, where maybe they've experienced some sort of trigger, whether it be a loss or a divorce or even menopause, right? And then they find themselves engaging in disordered behaviors. There's that middle place between the trigger and the start of the behaviors and an actual sort of full-fledged eating disorder. And so the more we can kind of help people in that middle space, the better. And part of it is being able to ask for help when you are kind of in that vulnerable spot where if you don't ask for help, maybe it could lead to an actual diagnosis or disorder.
I love everything that you've been touching on, and I appreciate that you're bringing more nuance into the conversation about eating disorder recovery, what it is, and also highlighting not only the middle place as like this sort of psychological place, but also eating disorders in midlife and all the topics you talked about, pregnancy, relationships, topics that would be important to people in midlife and beyond in that aspect too. So thank you for bringing this work into the world. If people want to buy it, what are the avenues right now?
So it is going to be coming out August 5th, so super soon, but you can pre-order it. So if you go on Amazon or Barnes and Noble's website or your local independent bookstore's website, it should be there. And so if you pre-order it, you'll get it right on August 5th. If you're listening to this after August 5th, you can just go ahead and order it and you'll receive it. And I hope, yeah, that it really does help people. I see this as being a book for folks with lived experience, but also for caretakers, for medical professionals who just want to learn more about eating disorders. And although its focus is on eating disorders, it really also touches upon motherhood and loss and grief and
Yeah.
embracing recovery in all of the various forms in which it takes place.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Mallory.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you.